I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar on pacemaker and defibrillator relationship status. It's complicated. Christy Pollard is going to be our presenter for today. She's a senior consultant with Haugen Consulting Group, and she has more than 20 years of industry experience. She is responsible for a lot of the development of our web-based modules, as well as instructor-led materials. And she also conducts training in ICD-10 CM, PCS, and CPT. She's also been called in to help with some performing DRG and APC audits, and what she enjoys, that gives her that direct contact with clients that she enjoys. Christy's a Colorado native who has never skied. In her spare time, she likes to do a lot of things outdoors, but it does not involve strapping two boards to her feet and barreling down a slippery slope. That's Christy's words, not mine. She always enjoys the mountains, and she certainly enjoys spending time with her family, including her beautiful baby girl. So Christy, I think at this time, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
All right. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you everybody for joining me today for a super fun topic on pacemaker and defibrillator coding. I don't really know where this title came from, other than when I had the idea to put this together, there were discussions about the new NCD for defibrillators, and there was a lot of press also about device credits and reporting failure to report device credits, leading to some OIG investigations. So whenever I think of pacemakers and defibrillators, I just think, oh man, this is not the easiest thing in the world to code. So there you go. Relationship status, it is pretty complicated, as you'll see as we go through today's webinar. On our agenda for this afternoon, we are going to touch very, very briefly on some anatomy and physiology. As anybody who's heard me present before knows, that I have a very strong belief that if you fully understand the procedure and the anatomy the anatomy and of the procedure being performed, that you will find it easier to code these procedures and kind of see where some of the method to Medicare's madness is. We are also going to talk about the technology, so not just the anatomy, but also really looking at the type of technology for pacemakers and defibrillators. And then we'll talk about the codes, obviously, and hopefully give you some tips to make that a little bit easier. I also want to go into the coverage criteria. What's not on my list here that we are going to cover today are the NCD changes for the defibrillator placements, and also Medicare coverage criteria using the KX and SC modifiers, and then finally touching on cardiac device credits. Is that enough for you? Getting into starting with just the general anatomy of the heart, there are a few key structures that I want to point out. And I will also tell you that throughout this presentation, I use a bunch of acronyms. I'm trying not to put so many words on a page, but sometimes that's almost impossible. So there are a bunch of acronyms here, and I did my best to get them all into one acronym list at the end of this presentation. So if you are looking at this later and wondering what the heck I was talking about, then those are at the end of the presentation. A couple of structures to focus on: the 4 different chambers of the heart, the right and left atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle are important. On the pacemakers and the defibrillators, almost everything we're dealing with will be on the right side of the heart. So we're usually looking at the right atrium and right ventricle. Sometimes we look at the left ventricle. Another structure that is important in pacemaker and defibrillator coding is the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus this shows an inside view of the right atrium of the heart, and there is an opening there for the coronary sinus. It is the main vein of the heart. So all of the blood, after it goes through the coronary arteries, perfuses the heart, and on its return back to the inside of the heart to pick up more oxygen, it lands in the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus empties into the right atrium of the heart, and then it blood keeps circulating through the lungs to pick up oxygen. The reason that the coronary sinus is an important structure is that a lot of times they will use it to place a lead to pace the left ventricle. And if you're familiar with cardiac catheterization coding, you know that the approach to the left side of the heart and the right side of the heart is different. You have an arterial approach to get to the left side, whereas you have a venous approach to get to the right side. By using the coronary sinus to place a lead to pace the left ventricle, we are able to do the entire procedure transvenously without having to puncture the patient on the arterial side. So there is a quick and dirty on the 4 chambers of the heart and the coronary sinus. The electrical system of the heart, I want to go over just briefly. I find it fascinating, and I could probably talk about this for a whole hour, but I won't. You probably recall back to your first A&P class that the sinoatrial or SA node is the natural pacemaker of the heart, and that's where the heartbeat starts. That the nervous system kind of gives the signal to the sinoatrial node to fire, and it sends electrical impulses throughout both atria. And the picture that's shown here has the yellow, which is showing the direction of electrical conduction. And this septum, the wall between both the atria and the 2 ventricles, is inert, and it will not allow for electricity to pass through. It's kind of like rubber. But in order to condense that electrical signal into a single point, there's another node right between the atria and the ventricles, and that's called the AV node, atrioventricular node. And just below that is the bundle of His, and that the electrical impulse goes from SA node to AV node to bundle of His, into the bundle branches, and then out through the Purkinje fibers. So you get this electrical impulse starting in the top part, the high right atrium is the way that electrophysiologists call it. High right atrium down to the AV node, and then out through both walls of the ventricles. So when you hear the physicians talking about patients having a bundle branch block or a first or second or even 3rd degree heart block, the problem is that electrical impulses are not efficiently or completely getting to the left or right atria, or sorry, left or right ventricles, or both sides. So there's your typical cardiac electrical system. And remember on the previous screen, I mentioned that if with pacemakers and defibrillators, we're going to be on the right side of the heart most of the time. And that makes sense because all of our electrical conduction really is located on the right, or we can get to it from the right side. So let's talk about basic pacemaker and defibrillator components. There are, and we're going to talk about the difference between pacemakers and defibrillators here in a minute, but they both have the same basic type of components that are being put in place. And today we are talking about permanent placement. And I will also say I had to cut some slides out of today's presentation in order to get it to fit in an hour-long format. I will not be covering subcutaneous defibrillators today. I will not be covering leadless pacemakers today, loop recorders, or some of the other types of procedures that we see here. I really wanted to focus just on permanent pacemakers and implantable cardioverter defibrillators today, and the coverage criteria and device credits. So you have 2 pieces to both devices. You have a generator, and that generator includes all of the electronics, the battery, and the connections for the leads. And that is placed into a subcutaneous pocket that the physician creates in the chest area. And then the leads are the part that actually goes in the heart. And that includes wires, insulation, and fixation mechanisms. And when these are done in the cath lab, most of them are, those leads are placed transvenously. So they're advanced through the vein into the heart where they're anchored in place, and then connected to that the device in the subcutaneous pocket. So you've got your leads and you've got your generator. So let's talk permanent pacemaker. And again, today I'm only going to talk about permanent pacemakers. There always seems to come the question of when can we code a temporary pacemaker, and should we code it in addition to some of these other procedures? And that's kind of a whole other track, but and it really depends on the other procedure that's being done. So pacemakers from here on out are going to be referred to in this presentation as PPM. Again, trying to save a little bit of screen space and not have so many words on a screen, and you'll see I failed miserably in some of these. But the indication for placing a pacemaker is a patient who has bradycardia, and that means the heart's beating too slow. There are two main types of bradycardia. You either have sick sinus syndrome, so there's a problem with the SA node firing, or heart block, which was what I was mentioning before. Whereas for some reason, you've got the SA node that's firing okay, you've got the AV node, everything's okay until it gets into those Purkinje fibers, and then you have some heart block. By the way, AV node dysfunction results in complete heart block. So remember that AV node is the one node in the middle of that wall that will allow electrical impulses into the ventricles. If that's not working, then you have a patient whose ventricles are not beating. And a lot of times you may see a patient going into the EP lab having an AV node ablation, and the very next procedure is placement of a pacemaker. And that patient will be pacemaker dependent for life once that AV node has been destroyed or ablated. So the action of a pacemaker, the point of a pacemaker is that it will pace the heart back into normal sinus rhythm. And conventional lead placement, and I say conventional because we're going to talk about the cardiac resynchronization therapy coming up here in a couple of screens, but the conventional lead placement, the old-fashioned pacemaker, is either a single chamber or a dual chamber. And conventional lead placement is always on the right side of the heart. It doesn't matter if it's single or dual, it's always on the right side. So a single chamber pacemaker has leads in either a lead in either the right atrium or right ventricle, whereas a dual chamber has two leads, one placed in the right atrium and another in the right ventricle. Now the implantable cardioverter defibrillator, from now on, I'll refer to as ICD, which gets kind of confusing because we talk about ICD-10 codes sometimes, but for this presentation, ICD means implantable cardioverter defibrillator. And the indication for placing an ICD is tachycardia. So pacemaker, heart's beating too slow. A defibrillator, the heart's beating too fast. However, I will say that defibrillators also have pacing capability. So a defibrillator, an ICD, can do everything a pacemaker can do and then more. So the conditions that we're looking at treating here could be a supraventricular tachycardia, could be a fib, a flutter, or ventricular tachycardia. It could also be tachybrady syndrome for patients who fluctuate between that fast and that slow heart rate. And the action of this is, in addition to being able to pace, it can shock the heart when it beats too fast, in addition to pacing for bradycardia. And I never really thought too much about this until I had a friend who has an ICD in place, and she told me what it feels like when her ICD fires. Wow, excuse me. She said that it brings her to her knees. So, here I'm thinking, oh, it's just something that, your heart beats too fast sometimes, and so it fires and you don't really notice. And she said, you absolutely notice. You feel like you got a jolt, like you stuck your finger in a light socket because you are getting a shock. So it's something quite different than what we see with the pacemaker. And again, same thing as the pacemaker. An ICD conventional lead placement is either a single or dual chamber, but you may notice multiple leads going to a single heart chamber. And the leads have different capabilities. They either have sensing, pacing capability, or they have defibrillator capability. So you may see one or more leads going to either the right atrium or ventricle, and that would be a single chamber. And if it's in both the right atrium and right ventricle, then it's a dual chamber device. So besides, this is actually a joke. What's the difference between a pacemaker and an ICD? And I will tell you, this is a coding joke because the difference between a pacemaker and an ICD is tens of thousands of dollars. So if you did not hear that, I'll repeat it. Tens of thousands of dollars is the difference between coding a pacemaker and an ICD. So it's really important that we don't mix these devices up. If you have coded a pacemaker when it should have been an ICD, then you've lost some money. And the payment difference is tremendous. The ICDs pay about 3 times more than the pacemakers under APCs on the hospital side. And it's the device that's expensive. If you are working for a facility and you code according to high dollars, a lot of times these are those one-day outpatient stays that are, upwards of $100,000 or more, and it's because of the device. So make sure you're paying critical attention. The non-joke part, well, I guess the compliance risk is not very funny. It's very serious, but the pacemaker paces the heart, whereas the ICD can shock in addition to pacing. And pacemaker treats bradycardia, ICD treats tachycardia, can also treat bradycardia. And again, the cost of that device is really the critical factor for us when it comes to revenue integrity. So I've talked about the conventional devices. Let's talk a little bit about cardiac resynchronization therapy. Cardiac resynchronization therapy, which is shown throughout this presentation as CRT, is also known as biventricular pacing. And biventricular devices can either be pacemakers or ICDs. And the indication for this, it would be a patient who has heart failure with arrhythmia. And the idea is that it's going to pace both ventricles to beat in unison. Again, it's either a pacemaker or a defibrillator. And your lead placement, wow, I should have an additional one on here. So we've got single chamber. You can have a single chamber device or a dual chamber device, and then they add an additional lead in either the left ventricle or the coronary sinus. Again, that's why this coronary sinus is important. And this particular image shows what would be a dual chamber in addition to this coronary sinus lead. So you can see we've got leads in the right atrium, right ventricle, I know it's kind of small, and then another one in the coronary sinus. Technically, it's called a multiple lead device, which we're going to get to here in just a minute. So the one thing that you need to recognize as you are coding these, the one thing, that's funny, I'm going to say that about 5 times during this presentation. The one thing you need to know, one of the many things you need to know as you're coding these procedures is as you're reading the procedures, if everything's on the right side, then you're pretty good. But if anything is placed in the coronary sinus or the left ventricle, you need to have this little light bulb that goes off in your head that's like, ooh, that's not normal. That's not a conventional device, and it's going to change my code assignment. Okay, Kathy, that's going to bring us to the first polling question. Would you launch the poll for us, please?
Certainly. So the question is, a PPM ICD with leads in the left and right ventricles is a dual chamber device, a CRT device, or both a dual and chamber CRT? So this is what we want to know from you. A PPM ICD with leads in the left and right ventricles is a dual chamber device, a CRT device, or both a dual chamber and CRT device? So we've got responses slowly trickling in. I'm seeing a lot of thinking going on with this one, and I think, Christy, we're going to have some wonderful discussion with this one. So yeah, kind of get a consensus, if you're with a group of people. So what do you guys think? Is it a dual chamber, a CRT, or both a dual chamber and a CRT? So I'm going to wrap it up here in just a couple seconds. Anybody else want to weigh in on this? I'm closing the poll. 3, 2, 1. Christy, like I said, we've got kind of responses all over the place. So we'll have some great discussion. So we've got 50% of our polling audience is saying it's both dual chamber and CRT, followed by 30% is saying it's a CRT device, and then we've got 20% is saying nope, it's a dual chamber device.
Okay, so dual chamber devices are conventional devices. A dual chamber device means that we have leads in the right atrium and the right ventricle. In this case, we have leads in the left and right ventricles. That's a biventricular pacemaker, which is a CRT device. So the correct answer here is a CRT device. Now, I'm sure 50% of you probably went with dual chamber and CRT because there are leads in two chambers. But remember that dual chamber is a conventional device with everything on the right side. If there's right and left, it's a CRT. And we're going to go over this some more as we go through the presentation. All right, Miss Kathy, if you'll bring me back into our PowerPoint. Thank you. So CPT coding for pacemakers and ICDs. The code range is 33202 to 33273, and there are a couple things that I want to tell you about this code range before we really get into the nuts and bolts of all of this. By the way, how do you like my little electrician team here today? That was the closest thing I could find to electricians, and I thought it was super cool that we had a girl in there. Anyway, the code range includes codes for insertion, removal, and replacement of both pacemakers and ICDs. Here's my own personal commentary on the subject. You can tell that these CPT codes were not arranged and developed by a coder because I think we're all just a little too anal retentive, maybe. They're kind of all over the place. Some of the codes are out of numerical sequence. You don't have all the pacemaker codes together and then all the ICD codes together, and the structure isn't even the same between them. So for example, we have 3 different codes for placement of a new pacemaker depending on the number of leads, but we only have 1 code for placement of a new ICD system regardless of the number of leads. So when I look at it, it drives me a little crazy. If you logged on early today, we probably heard Kathy and I talking about me having control over today's presentation, and sometimes I really would love to have control over the CPT codebook, but I want to point it out because it's kind of hard to find what you need. And if this is an area that you code frequently, I do recommend that you become extremely familiar with this entire section, that you highlight, circle, make notes, or do whatever you have to do to make sure that you are finding the appropriate codes. The code range is also preceded by extensive coding guidelines, and having coded now for 23 years and starting as a CPT coder, I can tell you that CPT has come a really long way with their guidelines and their notes. There's a lot of meat at the beginning of this chapter or this section, and I do recommend that you go out and read those. And the code range is also preceded by a reference table that I think makes our lives a whole lot simpler. And in this presentation, I've kind of broken that out and put it into my own type of format. But even if you didn't have my presentation with you, hopefully you have a CPT book which has that great table. If you're coding using an encoder, hopefully you have access to be able to get into a code book version of CPT to see what that looks like. This is where the waters get really muddy. There are several codes that refer to single lead, dual lead, and multiple lead systems. And in the CPT code book, they talk about devices that allow for pacing of 1, 2, or 3 chambers. And it gets confusing on the CRT devices. So that example that I gave earlier, where we had a lead in the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and I said, no, that's not a dual chamber, because a dual chamber means that leads are in the right atrium and right ventricle. So this slide, if you don't take anything else away from today, I think this slide is probably the most critical. A single lead system is a single chamber device, and you have leads in the right atrium or right ventricle. A dual lead is a dual chamber device with leads in the right atrium and right ventricle. Again, conventional systems, everything is on the right side of the heart. Multiple lead is that one that should trigger that light bulb in your brain. It's like, whoa, this is not a conventional device, therefore it is a multiple lead device. So you will have leads in the right atrium and or right ventricle, and that left ventricular lead as well. And remember that coronary sinus equals left ventricular lead. And there is a statement in CPT Assistant from December 2013 that says whenever a left ventricular lead is implanted, the system is referred to as a multiple lead system. So just always think single and dual, everything's on the right. Multiple is that weird one where we've got that left ventricular or coronary sinus lead. So codes for insertion. And in the CPT book, they've got one long table, and it is organized pretty well. I like the way I organize mine better. Mine has pictures, which, pictures are always better. But insertion of a complete system, and a complete system, in case you're wondering what that is, that's what the pictures are referring to. It's the generator that includes the battery pack and the wires, the leads or the wires. So we've got the plug-in showing our leads, and then the battery, which is our generator. The way that this table reads is the type of device is on the left, and then we've got columns with codes for the pacemaker and the ICD. You'll notice a couple of add-on codes here, and it's pretty simple when we're looking at placement of a conventional device. You see we've got insertion of a dual chamber pacemaker with leads in the right atrium and right ventricle is 33208. And then for a single lead, 33206, and single lead in the right ventricle is 33207. Notice that the ICD code is all the same, so they don't really care where the leads are in an ICD. The generator with dual chamber leads plus an LV lead for the CRT, and that CRT lead is the 33225. It's an add-on code that is coded when, in addition to your pacemaker placement code, when the left ventricular lead is placed at the time of that device. They can retrofit a lead. So if they've already got an existing system in place and they put the lead in later, there are different codes for that. And I'm getting there. So if you're wondering what it is, I'm getting there. And then you see, again, for dual chamber, or sorry, single chamber right atrial lead versus right ventricular lead, and what the codes would be for that. So a couple of tips for coding insertion of a complete system. Again, most of the codes are for the conventional systems. You do want to pay attention to the device type. I have seen this miscoded in audits, and it's a big find for an auditor. And I always tell people, you know, if you ever feel like your auditors are nitpicky, it's probably because they're bored, because auditing isn't fun unless we find something. I always try to be fair, but it's kind of the truth. But this is a big find for an auditor because it means a lot of money. And again, depending on which side of the coin we're on, if you coded an ICD and it should have been a pacemaker, it's a compliance issue. If you coded a pacemaker and it should have been an ICD, it's revenue loss. So either way, it's going to be really critical. And remember, the price difference on an APC paid claim is going to be about 3 times. An ICD will be 3 times the cost of a pacemaker. So the CRT, again, this is the placement of the left ventricular lead. And the way that CPT set this up is all of the codes, most of the codes that we have are for a conventional pacemaker. There are only 3 codes that relate to this left ventricular lead. So you code your whatever system they put in, whether it be a pacemaker, an ICD, single chamber, or dual chamber. And if they do all of that in one procedure, then you add this 33215, which is an add-on code at the same time as lead and generator placement. If they come back later and add a left ventricular lead to an existing device, then it's code 33224. And it's not an add-on code because there's nothing to add it on to. That's the only procedure performed. The other code that we have for the CRT is 33226 for repositioning of a previously placed left ventricular lead. So let's look at a couple of examples. We have in example 1, placement of a new PPM system with leads in the right atrium and right ventricle. And this codes to 33208. A dual chamber device, and we've got leads in the atrium and ventricle. Oh, the other thing I'll tell you about these CPT codes, make sure you read the entire code description, because I don't know that if I had written them, I would have written them, the descriptions, the way that they are. Sometimes it sounds like it's a generator placement, and so you don't finish reading the code description, and then at the very end it talks about leads. So make sure you read the entire code description and that it applies to the case that you're doing. In example 2, we have placement of an ICD CRT system with leads in the right atrium and ventricle, and lead placement in the coronary sinus for left ventricular pacing. So, ooh, I do have a wrong code on here. I just realized this is the code for pacemaker. This should be a 33249 for an ICD, but the add-on code for that left ventricular lead, which is placed in the coronary sinus, is the same, and it's 33225. So again, the CRT codes do double duty for both pacemaker and ICD devices. Now, in this situation, when you have insertion of a generator only, no leads, just generator, we have codes for just the placement of the generator. Now, why would we ever do this? And this is kind of where some of the waters get muddied even further. You have a generator that's taken out because it's end of life or whatever, and you see our happy strong battery here, and then our low drained battery on the right. The problem is that if they take out a device and put in a new device, you have to know when to code a removal and insertion versus a replacement, and we're going to get to that. So keep in mind that this is just insertion of a generator without leads, without replacement of that device. The next slide shows insertion of leads only, and this is probably going to be a more common occurrence. You may have a patient who comes in to have a device upgraded, or perhaps it's a generator that has reached its end of life. They replace the generator and then they realize that one of the leads is not working properly, so they put in a new lead. And that would be a situation where you would use these codes. And then we have codes for removal without replacement. And this is fairly common. You may have a patient who is going to undergo some type of a procedure. They don't need their pacemaker anymore, so they decide to take it out. The thing is that they usually leave leads in place. They don't usually take leads out. They'll take the generator device out of the skin pocket, but they usually cap the leads and leave them in place. Once they place the leads into the heart, they kind of scar into place and they get stuck a little bit. And if you tug on them too much, you can cause some pretty nasty complications. And I would say that 99.9% of the cases that I've looked at where there's been a problem with the lead, they just capped it and left it in place. They usually require a thoracotomy to go in and really dissect through that tissue. But for most patients, they don't present a problem by just leaving them in place. Make sure that you're keeping an eye on that. So replacement. I talked about the insertion only. I talked about removal without replacement, and now let's talk about replacement. Some important things to note about this. All of the codes include the removal of the old device and placement of a new device. So you're not going to code removal in addition to replacement. And the replacement codes are only used when the exact same type of device is removed and replaced. They took out a pacemaker, they put in a new pacemaker. They took out an ICD, they put in a new ICD. If they flip-flop, if they take out a pacemaker and put in an ICD, that's not a replacement. That's removal of a pacemaker and insertion of an ICD, and vice versa. So you've got to read your operative reports really, really carefully. It may seem like kind of a no-duh moment after a while, but these reports are confusing. And I've seen it done. I've seen them confused many, many, many times, and I've done it myself as well. So the codes, removal with replacement of the same type of device, it's an awful lot of codes here. And, you know, they've also got, I've got an asterisk next to some of these codes in this table, because if they also placed a left ventricular lead for CRT, then you can add that 33225 as well. So let's talk system upgrade. System upgrade is a couple of different things. You either are upgrading a single chamber device to a dual chamber, or you're upgrading your CRT, upgrading to a CRT with placement of the left ventricular lead. Or you're upgrading to a CRT with placement of a left ventricular lead with a generator change. And sometimes they have to do that. It depends on how many leads they can plug into the generator. If the generator device is only a dual chamber and only has a place to plug in 2 leads, and you need to be able to plug in 3, then that's not going to work. They're going to have to replace the device. So you've got to read everything really, really carefully. A couple, the caution note at the bottom of here, beware of system upgrades that include replacement of other components. And I think those are the ones that drive me the battiest. They go in, it seems like it's going to be a simple generator change because of end of life. And it turns out that, oh, there was also one of the 2 leads that were in place was messed up, and they only replaced one, or they only placed a new one. So let's look at an example of that. We have a patient who presented for upgrade of a dual chamber pacemaker to a CRT pacemaker. The atrial lead was malfunctioning. It was capped and replaced, and a new left ventricular lead was placed, and the existing generator was exchanged for a CRT generator, and the existing RV lead and new RA and LV leads were connected to the device. What we have here is a patient, we have removal of the pacemaker generator. We have insertion of, sorry, I have the wrong code on there, or the wrong code description. 33206, insertion of or replacement of a pacemaker, right code, wrong description, 33206. And then we've got the 33225 for the placement of the leads. Okay, so this brings us to our next polling question. Kathy?
Okay, so the question is, how is replacement of a dual chamber PPM with a dual chamber ICD coded? Is it with ICD replacement, PPM replacement, or PPM removal and ICD insertion? Boy, that's a mouthful. So how is replacement of a dual chamber PPM with a dual chamber ICD coded? Is it with ICD replacement, PPM replacement, or PPM removal and ICD insertion? Boy, you guys are quick. I just switched over to my control panel. We've got, boy, no hesitation here on this one. If anybody else wants to weigh in, I'm going to close poll. 3, 2, 1. Christy, we've got 100% of the audience is saying it's the last one. It is PPM removal and ICD insertion.
Okay, yes, good job. So that's one where we have little discussion today. Kathy always says, oh, we're going to have great discussion. We won't have great discussion on this one. I'm kidding. Great job, because we want to remember we cannot mix our devices. You need to make sure that your pacemaker and your defibrillators are separate. Other codes that we may see, oops, sorry, Kathy, will you bring me back? We have codes for reposition, repair, and revision of the leads, but we also have some codes for relocation of the skin pocket. A couple things. Let's start with a discussion of the pocket revision. Pocket revision during device replacement is not coded separately. And it used to be that the code for relocation of the skin pocket, codes actually 33222 and 33223, the description used to read skin pocket revision, and it's bundled into the device replacement when they do a generator change. And a lot of physicians said, well, that really shouldn't be bundled because I had to do X, Y, and Z. I took out a pacemaker, but I put in an ICD, and defibrillators are bigger than pacemakers, so they always have to do a pocket revision. By the way, the best argument to a physician when he says, I have to be able to code for this. I have to be able to code for this because I couldn't possibly do the procedure without it. That is the best example for not coding it. Because if there is no way to do the procedure without doing this other procedure, it's a component and it's already bundled and figured into that comprehensive code. And that's why they created CCI edits. So they changed it. It is now relocation of skin pocket. You're pretty much never going to code a pocket revision anymore. And they may need to move the pocket. Maybe the device has migrated, or maybe there's an infection there and they want to move it to a different site. Repositioning of leads. I recently did an audit where they did a pocket relocation, and the coder assigned the correct code, whether 33222, whatever, for the relocation of the skin pocket, and they also coded repositioning of the leads. And what happened was they moved the pocket from one side of the chest to the other, and then they had to move the wires over to the device, and the coder coded that as a lead repositioning. That is not a lead repositioning. When we're talking about repositioning the leads, it's the cardiac portion of that. So they would have to be out of place within the heart chambers in order to be able to use 33215. So be really careful with that. It is assumed that if you moved the pocket, you moved the subcutaneous portion of the wires to reach the device. It's the whole point of the procedure. And we already talked about the bundling of the pocket revision. Programming device and evaluation codes. And again, I'm only pulling out the pacemaker and ICD programming codes here. There are additional codes here for loop recorders and I believe subcutaneous ICDs as well. But the programming device and evaluation codes, I think this is a great little table that shows you what is required to be reported or to be done in order to report these codes versus those optional elements that may be performed in addition. Now, what a programming is it's a face-to-face assessment of the device, including the battery, the leads, and its overall function. And then they make sure that the device is sensing and pacing appropriately and is programmed to the patient's to the physician's specifications for the patient. So programming is very patient specific to make sure that that device is programmed appropriately for that person. The codes in this code range are coded depending on whether it's a single, dual, or multiple leads system. So I know I didn't list them all out here, but you can see the list of codes in your CPT code book. I thought you would enjoy the required versus optional elements more than looking at a repeat of the code book. Similar to programming, except not really looking at making sure the device is programmed specifically for that patient, is interrogation. And device interrogation is a component of programming. So if you were to code an interrogation device along with programming, you are going to get an edit that tells you that the interrogation is bundled into the programming. And the interrogation looks at again, just the device. The codes 93288 and 93289 are for face-to-face interrogation, but with recent technology, we can now do this remotely as well, and the code range for that is shown in the purple box here on the bottom of your screen. DFTs are defibrillator threshold testing, and this is usually done at the same time as device placement, but it can also be done if a patient, after the device has been placed later. This is only done for defibrillators. It's not done for pacemakers because it's defibrillator threshold testing, not pacemaker threshold testing. And this is a device interrogation. They do an induction of VTAC or VFib, and then they look at the device programming to make sure that it's sensing and shocking and working appropriately. So the codes 93640 and 93641 are used when the DFT testing is done at the time of device insertion or replacement. The difference between the two codes is whether only the leads were tested or if the leads and the generator were tested. And it's usually the 93641. It's kind of, to me, I would want to make sure that both were working. If I was at risk for sudden cardiac death, I really would vote for making sure that both the leads and the generator were going appropriately. But physicians make that determination. So I will tell you it's usually the 93641, but it could be the 40. And then 93642 is the code that they use for DFT on an existing device when they bring the patient back at a later time. Okay, that's the coding. And I know that I kind of sped through all of that. I wanted to give you kind of the low-hanging fruit and the issues that I've seen with pacemaker and defibrillator coding. And I know I'm not the first one to give this presentation. What I also wanted to get into, though, were some of the coverage and payment issues that we've seen with these. And this may be a part of the presentation where a lot of coders are tempted to kind of take a nap and zone out for a bit. But I would just point out that in a lot of facilities, nobody really knows who is responsible for looking at this stuff. And I think as coders, it's good to be well-rounded and be able to know when to ask people questions and either go to our revenue integrity or department heads and say, you know, who is responsible for doing all this stuff? So here's the issue. National Coverage Determination 20.4 has been out there for quite a long time, and it is for implantable cardioverter defibrillators. And it is what outlines criteria from Medicare that make this a covered service. So you can't, not just every Medicare patient can go out and get an ICD. They need to meet coverage criteria in order for Medicare to pay for it. There's kind of a big issue right now. There was a decision memo, and I've listed the memo name here, that came out in February, and it didn't really have an effective date on it at the time, but we now know that it was effective on February 15th of this year. If you look up NCD 20.4, it has not been updated yet. So the decision memo has come out, and it has gone to the MACs, the Medicare Administrative Contractors, but the coverage determination manual from Medicare has not been updated yet. That is, and the NCD is kind of what tells payers what to do. So we're in a little bit of limbo here right now. You may or may not be getting denials on your pacemakers if you have made some decisions based off of this new decision memo that was released in February. I'm not going to read the whole memo to you. I'm going to tell you what the changes were and what some of the issues are. So the first thing is that, and you'll notice these are not coding things, but they're payment things that I think, you know, at least as coders, we should kind of start the ball rolling and start talking to some people and see how this is being done. So there's the decision to place an ICD has to be made based off of a shared decision making using an evidence-based tool. And this used to be something that had to be performed by an independent physician, not the doctor who was placing the device. However, that is no longer the case. It can now be done by the same doctor who's placing the device. The problem is that you have to have proof that this shared decision-making using evidence-based tool was used to make the decision to put in an ICD, and a lot of those tools are online. So the advice is place a paper copy of any paper-based tools that you use in the medical record, because if you get audited for coverage, you need to make sure that that's available. And if you do use an electronic tool, name the tool that was used in the medical records so that there is some sort of documentation that that was done. Also, there is an ICD registry, and it's something that hospitals pay to maintain their hospital or their ICD registry. And according to the decision memo, reporting through the ICD registry is now optional. However, because the NCD hasn't been updated yet, it is possible that you could still receive denials if you are not entering this into the ICD registry. So if you have made decisions in your facility not to submit data to the ICD registry, your Medicare payments could be at risk. A couple of other things, and these are some good things. So there is a waiting period, and a lot of the NCD criteria physicians really felt was outdated. You know, this is stuff that It's just not the way we practice medicine anymore. So there is an existing waiting period for an ICD implementation, and Medicare coverage says that they will not cover ICD placement within 40 days of an acute myocardial infarction or within 90 days of a coronary artery bypass graft or percutaneous transluminal coronary angioplasty. They have added 2 exceptions to that. If the patient needs a pacemaker in addition to that ICD and the pacemaker coverage criteria is met, they can put the device in. They have the ability to turn the defibrillator portion of the device off. And so they can put the device in, not turn on shocking capability, but still allow it to pace the heart. The other exception would be that a patient has an ICD in place already and it has reached the end of life. And, you know, the battery is dying, and obviously we want to get that switched out. So those are the 2 new exceptions. They also added a couple things and made some changes to the covered conditions. They have a list of tests that are adequate for evaluating left ventricular function. MRI has been added to that. And they also have said that patients with severe non-ischemic dilated cardiomyopathy, blah, 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 the rest of that, the red part is new, must be on optimal medical therapy for at least 3 months. And they've also removed class 4 heart failure requirement for CRT. On the pacemaker side, something that is going to hit closer to home for coders is the use of the KX modifier. And if you have not been using the KX modifier, then this is a great time to start listening again if you took a little bit of a snooze there for a minute. This is NCD 20.8.3 that says that Medicare will cover pacemaker insertion for patients with documented non-reversible symptomatic bradycardia due to sinus node dysfunction, or documented non-reversible symptomatic bradycardia due to 2nd degree and or 3rd degree atrioventricular block. These are things that we cannot report with diagnosis codes. We cannot report non-reversible symptomatic. We can report the bradycardia, we can report the 2nd or 3rd degree heart block, we can report sinus node dysfunction, but we cannot report the non-reversible symptomatic part. And it does require documentation in the medical record of these 2 conditions. If these 2 conditions, or one of these 2 conditions is documented, when you put in a new pacemaker, and this refers only to pacemakers, not ICDs, then you add the KX modifier, and that is an attestation saying that this patient meets Medicare criteria. It only applies to 3 codes, 33206, 33207, and 33208 for initial insertion of a complete pacemaker system. It does not apply to ICDs, and it does not apply to CRTs. So again, it's an attestation by claim submission, and the way it works is your ICD-10 code, ICD-10-CM, which is listed in your local payer policies, plus one of these 3 CPT codes with the KX modifier equals Medicare coverage. And this is a compliance risk. You may need to make sure that there's documentation in the record to support that KX modifier and that you're not just putting it on there. If you are a coder in the HIM department who assigns these pacemaker codes and you don't know about KX modifier, it's time to start asking who's putting it on there. You want to check local coverage determinations and local coverage articles as well for specific codes that are coded by your Medicare administrative contractor. Now, every MAC has a local coverage article on this topic, and they all read pretty much the same. And in addition to the KX modifier, they recommend the use of the SC modifier for medically necessary conditions requiring a pacemaker that are not addressed in the NCD. And the way that the LCAs have it is they list out series of codes. And they say all of the codes in group 1 get a KX modifier, all of the codes in group 2 get a KX modifier, and all of the conditions and procedures in group 3, which includes cardiac resynchronization therapy, pacemaker or generator replacements, and some of these other conditions, go to an SC modifier. So again, if you are a coder and you are assigning codes for pacemaker insertion and are not aware of the KX and SC modifiers, then you need to find out how they're being applied in your facility. Okay, I know I'm right on the money. So I'm going to give you the answer to polling question number 3. I'm almost done, I promise. The question is, which modifier should be added for replacement of a pacemaker when coverage criteria are met? And the answer for this, you may be thinking KX, but it's actually SC because it's a replacement. Remember that the KX modifier only applies to initial placement. It does not refer to replacements. For patients who don't meet the criteria, there is information in the local coverage articles about use of modifiers GA and GZ. GA is what we use when the patient signs an ABN, that's an advanced beneficiary notice. In layman's terms, it's a piece of paper the patient signs that says, yes, I realize that Medicare won't pay for this, I will be responsible for paying it, and oh well, basically. And this is something that is kind of tough to nail down in a facility. But GA modifier, if you got the ABN signed, GZ modifier, if you didn't get it signed, doesn't matter which one you report, it's going to get denied. It just shows how good you are at getting an ABN signed if you report the GA. And last thing I'm going to cover today are the device credits. This is not a coding function anymore. We used to report modifiers when devices were replaced for partial or total credit, and now it's completely a UB function, but we did market this both to coders and revenue management professionals. So here's the issue. Sometimes devices are replaced by the manufacturer at partial or full cost. And I would say probably about 10 years ago, we were seeing a lot of recalls with devices, and the manufacturers were replacing those devices at no cost to the facility. And remember, it's the device that's expensive. It's the device that is the reason that these are paying so much. So you can imagine, I'm making up a number, don't think that this is official. Let's say that you've got an ICD device that was replaced. You got $24,000 for that. And most of that was for the device itself, not for the procedure. Well, then you've kind of gamed the system in Medicare's eyes, and you have received more money than you should have. So this is an OIG target. There was a March 2018 report published where $4.4 million in overpayments for underreported devices or unreported device credits were identified. And if this is not something that is on your facility's radar, it should be, because it's on the OIG's radar. And the issue is that if you have a device that was supplied at no cost or with a credit of 50% or more, you have to report that on the claim. And on the claim form, in the value code section, you list FD. There's a value amount. You list the amount of the credit. And then there's a condition code that goes along with that, either 49, 50, or 53, to say what the problem was and why you received device credit for that. So if you're in coding management, I would recommend having a conversation with the billing department and make sure that this is happening. Okay, that is all for my presentation today. I have 2 full slides of references because a lot went into today's presentation, the acronyms as promised, and my email address, because I'm sure some people probably will have questions that I would like to answer. So that's going to do it for me. Kathy?
Thank you, Christy, for a wonderful presentation, and we want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. We have a list of upcoming webinars, which is on the last slide. So if you enjoyed today's webinar, you can see what we have upcoming next month. We've got, those 2019 ICD-10 CM updates are coming up, as well as the PCS next month. So hard to believe October 1st is around the corner. So as you close out, please take a couple minutes, complete the survey, as well as include any people who are in the room with you for the CEU attendance, and then look for a follow-up email by tomorrow afternoon, probably, with the recording link, as well as all the materials once again. So thank you, Christy, for a wonderful presentation, and we want to thank everybody for joining us. Go have a great afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.